Hello, everyone. I'm John Hall. This is Cactus Country that we're at today. This is where I grew up. My parents and I, in a sense, started this garden back in 1988, although I didn't have a lot to do in the early years because I was too young. But yeah, essentially this garden's 36 years old, which is the same age that I am. Back in 88, or maybe it was even 86, is when the gardens sort of first were planted. And then in 1988, we officially opened. And so growing up, my backyard was a cactus garden and I didn't know any different. Went to school locally at Strathmerton, used to catch the bus from the front gate. And I remember even back in primary school and early high school days, I used to imagine buses coming down the driveway. I remember going to primary school specifically and seeing kids' parents had so much time to hang out with their parents and spend time with them on weekends, and they weren't always working. And I always thought to myself, like, I want that. And I couldn't understand why we couldn't have it. But Dad was, I guess, so determined and such a creative person that he had this vision in his head of what he wanted to create. Yeah, my early childhood was helping Mum and Dad do jobs around the house or do jobs around the farm. We grew green zucchini and yellow squash commercially to sort of fund the beginning of Cactus Country. So that was really early days. We had a backpacker hostel here. So we used to employ people from all around the world. And I think growing up and being a young kid, it was a really interesting experience. And I think it was very different to what kids I went to school with experienced, because I was having these really mature conversations from a very young age with tourists, whether that be selling them plants, showing them around the garden, or whether that be backpackers from all around the world who are, living and working here for months at a time. And so I think I got exposed to such a different way of thinking from such a young age. And I think that ultimately really shaped who I am today. Like, even though there were definitely some really hard times, probably from, primary school, high school, and early 20s, like trying to transition from having a commercial farm that was turning over $1 million, but really not very profitable. The expenses were so high and the market of, what produce was worth was so rapidly fluctuating that it was very hard to make sustainable income. I think luckily the conversations I had with backpackers, the amount of time I spent in a tractor listening to audiobooks and podcasts, I really started to try and come up with new ways to make money and make revenue and really help Mum and Dad get out of this situation. It was almost like a rat race of its own, where you would plant zucchinis, you would employ all these people to pick them and pack them, and you would get to the end of the year and what did you really have to show for it? Like, we could buy new equipment on the odd occasion to improve our productivity, but at the end of the day, I really didn't like that we were at the mercy of the market. And being at the mercy of the market didn't make sense to me, because how much money we could make was purely dictated by how many people were growing zucchinis. And that just didn't logically make sense to me after a while. So I think it was really early days of Facebook, and I'm trying to pinpoint it. But I remember Instagram had sort of just started, and one of the backpackers said to me, "Oh, you on Instagram?" And I said, "Oh, what's Instagram?" So we went into the gardens, and it was a really funny day. We went out and we found a flowering agave, I think it was, and we took a photo of it, we posted it up, added some hashtags, and I remember getting this real adrenaline or dopamine hit, because overnight we had 70 likes on this image and comments, and obviously being so early, and I think there was so few people putting content out at the time, it really took off. And in a short amount of time, we grew our following quite rapidly. Yeah, it was interesting how everyone was so focused on Facebook, and then Instagram came, and I think a lot of people didn't really pay attention to it in the beginning, but then suddenly, we had both platforms performing really well. And keep in mind that at this stage we were transitioning out of farming, but it was still a very intense farming practice. So it was wild. I mean, I was spending a huge amount of time on social media trying to grow our following, and I was battling my parents who were more old school thinking in a way of, if they couldn't see you physically doing something, then they thought that you were slacking off. And so I remember having many arguments with mum and dad about whether I was wasting my time developing our social media. And I must have got really frustrated at some point, because I said, will you track what people are coming through the garden and tell me how they're finding out about us? And it was something like 2 in 3 people at that stage. And I don't know exactly how many followers we had at the time, but I remember it being like around that 70% mark. And there were, a lot of them were day trip visiting from Melbourne. And so not only were mum and dad impressed at that statistic, but also Visit Victoria and Murray Regional Tourism were very intrigued by how we're able to attract such a large audience from such a long distance, and how we were sustainably doing that. And it was just purely documenting the things we were doing. I don't think I ever had this fancy strategy in my head of like, we'll promote this or we'll do this. It was very much just like, what are we doing today? Dad and I were always working on projects around the garden. There was always something happening. Dad was obsessed with, and still is obsessed with, growing this huge cactus garden. So, yeah, whether it be building new hothouses, renovating the cafe, planting more cacti, expanding the gardens, jumping on excavators, landscaping areas, like it was just never ending. I guess fast forward to today, and, it's, what is it? It's September 2024. And these days we get around 35,000 visitors a year. We're coming into our flowering season. So, yeah, pretty soon we'll have these big events happening like Fright Fest and Day of the Dead. Day of the Dead's our event of the year, which is, something that we're extremely passionate about growing. If you had been able to talk to my parents, Jim and Julie, and myself back in the 2000s, I don't think that we would have believed that what's happened would happen. And I think that just purely the behaviour of putting our heads down and continually developing and continually growing what's here has sort of led to what it is today. Yeah, so these days I think what's become really interesting to me is, even though I'm not trained in marketing at all, what I've learnt and how I've applied what I've learnt in social media has attracted people within the tourism and hospitality industries to this methodology of social media, I guess, and marketing, because I think traditionally the way that people think about marketing is promoting things. And I think the way I do it is different, and I think more effective, in that I believe that storytelling is marketing, and that if you just purely document what you're up to and show the world things that are interesting about your day-to-day, that they might be an office worker, or they might work, or they might live on the other side of the world. They might have a completely different life to the one that you have, but they'll find what you're doing interesting. And I don't think you need to attract all people. Like, you need to do what is unique to you, and then you'll find your audience that way. I speak specifically to my generation, as in millennials. I think the way that I communicate is a very millennial way of communicating. And I think because I grew up with backpackers and I met all of these people from around the world, I have a unique communication style, perhaps. But when I'm talking to people who are starting new businesses, what I notice is they get really hung up on sales. They're trying to create revenue very quickly. And so they're trying to promote their product, promote their service, but they haven't built a connection with anybody. So nobody really wants to buy from them. And I think what I try to teach them or show them through the content that we make is like, if you're passionate about what you do and you just showcase what you're passionate about, then you'll find people who are interested in what you do, and they'll ultimately end up potentially buying your product or service. And if you just be patient and enjoy that process and don't be in a rush to produce income, then I think that's a really sustainable way to grow. I think like a really interesting example was the paddock at Yulupna. So I could tell this in a couple of ways. So Dad and I were really starting to come to a head in terms of managing Cactus Country. Like, the reality is I thought that I was ready to run Cactus Country, and Dad didn't want to let go of control of the day-to-day running of the business. And I got to the point where I was frustrated, and I just said, I need to do my own thing. I need to have my own project. And if I couldn't find that here at Cactus Country, then I was going to start looking elsewhere to find it. And it's interesting how timing works. But essentially what happened was a wedding and accommodation venue just up the road became open for sale. Actually, it had been for sale for quite a long time, but nobody was interested in buying it. I tried to get a loan to purchase the property with Mum and Dad. They were actually quite supportive of me buying it. Just the way that the financial sort of climate was at the time, it was really hard to borrow money from the bank to purchase such a large property. And so a friend of mine, Joel, who I went to primary school with, timing just worked perfectly. Our worlds aligned, and Joel actually purchased the property and I was able to lease it from him. So that all worked out perfectly. So we bought it, and we immediately started renovating the cabins. So Joel and his family went out there, got all the cabins up to scratch, and the day we finished our renovations was the day we had a wedding check-in, our first wedding. So it was absolutely insane. And, those early days of that new business were really tricky because the person we'd bought it off didn't have social media, didn't have a website, had absolutely no brand. Turned out to be a bit of a blessing in disguise. We rebranded, we renovated, and we started building our following, and we started building our brand, essentially, like telling our story. And then, things have a habit of, especially early on in business, I think it can be really tricky. If you don't have a lot of money behind you, you have to establish a customer base, in a sense. So we didn't really have anyone. We had no brand recognition. We had to start from scratch. And yeah, floods came, COVID came, like that's how we started our business. It was absolutely insane time to be building what we were trying to build. But once again, we picked up the property at a really good price. We were able to renovate the cabins, and we really were starting from scratch. So I had the commitment to Joel of paying my lease monthly, and there was no moving that. He needed to be able to pay a loan on the finance. And so I had to be able to service that. So I went and got a job at Moira Shire doing marketing. And even though that took me away from the business because it was so early, I didn't really need to be there day in, day out. So I started out working at Moira. I was working 5 days a week, and then I negotiated a 4-day work week. So I was able to condense my full-time hours into 4 days. That gave me a 3-day weekend to work on the business. And then I went part-time, so I was 3 days a week, and that worked really well. And then I just got way too busy. So I lasted at Moira Shire for about 18 months. And in that time, Moira Shire itself transformed from being under the management of counsellors to then having administrator and then having 3 administrators and then having 2 administrators. And we went through about 3 interim CEOs. So that time period was a really interesting time from seeing how a big organisation transforms perspective, seeing how local council and government works, being involved in media and marketing within a shire and a council, but also having a job that interacted a lot with all the departments. So I was really able to see sort of how councils work from the top to the bottom. It was so fascinating. Like, I would 100% do that all again. That was one of the most enjoyable, but also one of the hardest times of my life, because I was juggling so many different things at once. That story started, I was trying to tell the story of like building a social media following and how that translates to business. Tell about Dad. Yeah, what do you want to know? I think Dad is one of the most creative, determined people that I've ever met. Doing what I do, marketing, consulting, tourism, accommodation, weddings, I don't think I've met a second Jim Hall. I don't think they exist. I think that the way Dad's brain works is just so fascinating. And what he's created is a true expression of, he builds what's in his head. He sees a space and he imagines what should be there. And as he puts it together, it all evolves. And even the way he's spaced cacti, I mean, what started as a 1/4 acre quickly grew. And when it grew, Dad realised that all of those plants were not going to fit into that 1/4 acre when they got to maturity. So early on, all he had was a shovel and a wheelbarrow. And he started building this, I think it was about 5 or 6 acres, probably like in that first 10-year period. And so, you know, think about what that would have been like for Dad. Would have been in his 30s and he'd come out of working on orchards, picking fruit commercially, doing AI, like as in artificial insemination on cows. He grew up on the family dairy farm. He had 5 siblings. He had 3 sisters and 2 brothers. He was the eldest, so he was responsible for everything. His dad was a bit of a creative and a gardener, so he grew up in that space. He saw, you know, what it was like to build a garden, and they moved a lot as kids, so he had to help his dad move the garden. I think all of that really shaped the way that Dad saw the world. And he wanted to build something that people would come from far and wide to see. And so, you know, his determination to do that, I think, is really inspiring. And I think a lot of people come here and I think they think they're coming to see a cactus garden, but I think what they walk away with is this feeling of like, wow, in a sense, somebody had a vision in their head to create a cactus garden in Strathmerton of all places in the middle of nowhere, and they've been able to build what is now like a 12 acre going on 20 acres of garden, and people from all around the world come to see it. And I just think that's inspiring and incredible, because the amount of times we should have given up, the amount of times that we went bankrupt, not actually bankrupt, but close enough to almost be bankrupt. It was so stressful and it was so difficult. But here we are today. And I think in those days, that's what it took to succeed. If you were starting with nothing, you had to work really hard. All you had was your time. And so, yeah, that's sort of Dad. Yeah. Mum's incredible. I like to say mum's where I get my empathy from. She's one of the kindest, most caring and compassionate people you'll ever meet. She's loyal and almost to a fault. I mean, how she was able to support Dad with his crazy dream throughout all of these years, even though her background and her upbringing was much more of the normal, traditional, 9 till 5, work a job, buy a house, raise a family. Here, mum was town girl turned into a now farmer who had to essentially learn how to do all of the things that dad didn't really have the skills in. So dad was the creative. He was the hard worker. He was out building things. And meanwhile, mum had to pick up all of the pieces and raise a family. And so I think in a way, like this would not be here without mum. And even though I think a lot of people would attribute the success of the gardens to the creator, I think that a lot of credit, if not most of the credit, should go to mum, because without her, the backpackers wouldn't have been paid. There wouldn't have been bank loans. Nobody to juggle the financials when it was really difficult and you had to do credit transfers on cards or go to the bank and essentially negotiate to get enough money to start the next zucchini season that got you through the next 8 months. So mum is just the most incredible person in that she had the most thankless role, but she was so loving and caring and hardworking. And she was just as determined as dad in a sense, but just in a totally different space. And so, yeah, without her, this wouldn't be here. And I think also without her, my sister Sarah and I wouldn't be the people we are today, because dad is much more from the school of hard knocks, whereas mum's family was much more empathetic, kind and loving. And so the balance of those two worlds was really good. Like, I get my determination from dad, but I get my love of people from my mum. And so those two things together, I think they work really well. And if I had just had one, I think I'd be very introverted and isolated. And if I had just had the empathy side, I think I'd be a really kind and caring person, but I don't think I'd have the work ethic to back up and do the things that I'm inspired to do. So Dad made it very, very clear very early on that he was not in charge of the tourists. He was building a garden and he was planting zucchinis and he was doing all of those sort of more physical tasks. And mum's role was to work out everything else. Today is a good example. We're going to have maybe 400 or 500 plus people through. If things get really busy, the most Dad will do to help out is go upstairs and do dishes. He would rather wash dishes than talk to the customers. And then the really strange thing about all of it, I think he's almost got like he's so introverted, I think, that he almost doesn't like interacting with guests. But if you actually catch him in the gardens doing work and go and talk to him, you won't be able to shut him up. If you say, "Oh, wow, I can't believe what you built here," it's on. You will hear the story. You will be told about how it started and how it got to where it is today. So Dad's this really interesting character where he seemingly doesn't want to interact with people, but when he does, he loves it. Mum's so busy doing all of the behind the scenes things and keeping the wheels moving. And I also think she doesn't enjoy the outside work. And in fact, I would say, generally speaking, Mum doesn't even enjoy the job or the role she has. It's just that she's still to this day so dedicated to helping Dad that she plays the role she needs to for everything to work. And like they're both at an age now where their friends are, retiring and they've often been in roles where they've got, either super or some sort of way of funding their retirement. And meanwhile, Mum and Dad are building a new house. They're still working day to day in the business. And I think in their minds that they believe if they stop working that they're going to age. I think Mum would like to do less now, but I think at the same time, it's quite addictive being in a business like Cactus Country because you meet all of these amazing people from all around the world, and it's a really fun business to be involved in. And there's a lot of opportunities that come your way that are so enjoyable from a social interactions perspective. Yeah.